Jace Carter thought he was untouchable, a social media king, a thrill seeker who thrived on pushing limits for millions of fans. But when he sets fire to a Royal Guard's hat as a harmless prank, his life shatters in an instant. Tackled, arrested, and sentenced to an unthinkable 10 years in prison, the world watches in shock as a simple joke turns into a global firestorm of controversy. Some call it justice, others call it a setup. But when leaked footage exposes a chilling conspiracy, Jace realizes he's not just fighting for his freedom. He's battling a system that wants to bury him forever. Before we dive into this insane story, buckle up, get ready, and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have a special surprise you won't want to miss. Jace Carter grinned at the camera, adjusting his angle to capture the perfect shot. The city skyline gleamed behind him, a backdrop of power and tradition that contrasted sharply with the chaos he thrived on. His phone screen lit up with thousands of live viewers, hearts and laughing emojis flooding the chat. He lived for this. The rush, the attention, the sheer electricity of knowing that at this very moment the world was watching him. "All right, guys," he said, voice slick with confidence. "We're here, outside the palace, and you already know what's about to go down." The crowd around him bustled with tourists, cameras flashing as they admired the silent, stoic royal guards standing in their pristine uniforms. These soldiers were famous for their unshakable discipline, their ability to withstand anything without breaking character. People poked and prodded, snapped photos inches from their faces, yet the guards didn't even blink. Jace had bigger plans. He turned to his cameraman, Logan, who smirked knowingly. They'd rehearsed the setup, get close, light the match, and run. A harmless prank, just another video for his millions of followers to eat up. A title already formed in his head: "I set a Royal Guard's hat on fire. His reaction will shock you." Perfect clickbait. Jace strolled forward, hands in his pockets, a casual air masking his hammering pulse. The guard didn't move. Perfect. With a swift flick, Jace pulled out a tiny lighter, its flame flickering against the wind. He hesitated only for a second before touching it to the corner of the guard's towering hat. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a wisp of smoke curled upward, then flame. Jace burst into laughter, spinning toward the camera, arms raised. "Oh my God, yo, chat, did you see that?" The comments flooded in instantly. "Bro's insane, legend, you're so done, dude, run." The guard remained motionless, but the street around them erupted into chaos. A collective gasp, then shouts. Jace barely had time to process it before they came for him. A wave of security surged through the crowd. Black uniforms, bulletproof vests, not the tourist-friendly kind of authorities. Jace barely turned before a heavy force slammed into his back, knocking him off balance. The phone hit the pavement, skidding across the cobblestone as boots thundered. "Toward him, hands behind your back." Jace barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed him, yanking his arms backward. The force made him stumble, face scraping against the ground. Pain shot through his jaw as his chest crushed against the pavement. This wasn't a joke anymore. Logan was shouting, "Dude, it was just a prank! It's a prank, man!" More voices, distant and blurred. The live feed was still rolling. Somewhere, his audience was watching this unfold in real time. The last thing Jace saw before his vision blurred was his phone lying face up, chat messages flooding in like wildfire. Then, blackness. Jace's wrists burned as the cuffs dug into his skin, his pulse hammering against cold steel. His face throbbed where it had slammed into the cobblestone, but the pain was nothing compared to the panic gnawing at his insides. The crowd had gone silent, replaced by the distant wail of sirens. He struggled against the grip of the officers, hauling him forward, but they weren't having it. "Relax, man, it was a joke," Jace protested, his voice cracking. His words were swallowed by the chaos. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment like a spectacle, a public execution, where the only crime was chasing clout. They shoved him into a police van, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him. He barely had time to get his bearings before the vehicle lurched forward. His breath came in short gasps. This was different. This wasn't like getting kicked out of a mall or fined for trespassing. There was no security guard giving him a stern warning. These were armed officers, and they weren't treating him like a prankster. They were treating him like a criminal. His phone was gone. His connection to the world severed. He had no idea what was happening outside, but he could guess. His stream had still been running when they took him down. His audience Maybe this was the kind of outrage his fans lived for. Maybe they were already spamming hashtags, calling lawyers, demanding his release. He clung to that thought like a life raft. The van stopped. The doors swung open. Jace was dragged out into a dimly lit garage, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Officers flanked him on either side, leading him down a sterile hallway lined with metal doors. A police station. This was where they'd book him, right? Give him a fine, maybe lock him up for the night to teach him a lesson. Then he saw the holding cells. Dozens of men behind bars, some drunk, some dangerous, all of them staring. His stomach twisted. An officer pushed him into an interrogation room and slammed the door behind him. The room was bare, just a table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light casting a harsh glow. He was alone for a few minutes, his mind racing. Would they let him call someone? Logan, his agent, his lawyer. The door creaked open, and 2 officers stepped inside. One was middle-aged, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. The other was younger, his gaze cold. Jace Carter, the older officer said, taking a seat across from him. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Jace swallowed hard. It was a prank. The younger officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You committed an act of arson against a royal guard. That's not a prank. That's a crime. Jace felt the air squeeze from his lungs. Arson, that wasn't just a slap on the wrist offense. That was serious. That was prison time. For the first time, true fear settled in. Jace sat frozen in his chair, his mind stuck on one word: arson. They weren't treating this like some minor offense. They were treating it like a full-scale criminal act. His throat was dry, his palms sweaty, but he forced himself to keep up the bravado. He had gotten out of bad situations before. He just had to play it smart. Look, man, it was a prank, he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Nobody got hurt. The guard didn't even move. The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then placed a folder on the table. Slowly, deliberately, he slid it toward Jace and flipped it open. Inside were printed screenshots, frames from his own live stream. Jace's stomach churned. The images showed everything. The moment he flicked the lighter, the second, the flame. Caught! The look on the guard's face, unreadable but still frozen in duty. This wasn't a joke, the officer said. This was an attack on a member of the Royal Guard. Jace scoffed. Attack? Come on, man. He's fine. I mean, he didn't even flinch. The younger officer's lip curled. That doesn't change the law. He pulled out another paper, sliding it across the table. You're being charged with criminal arson, destruction of state property, and endangerment of a national officer. Jace blinked. You're joking. Nobody's laughing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. This wasn't a YouTube stunt anymore. This wasn't a fine. This was serious. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. All right, fine. So what happens now? What's the worst-case scenario here? The older officer clasped his hands. Together, the maximum penalty for these charges is 10 years in prison. Jace's heart stopped. 10 years. No way. This was insane. He wasn't a criminal. He was an influencer, a prankster, a guy who did dumb stuff for clicks, not someone who went to prison for a decade. He forced a smile, shaking his head. Nah, no way. My lawyers will clear this up. I'll pay a fine, maybe do some community service or something. But 10 years? That's ridiculous. The younger officer leaned in. Your lawyers have already been contacted. You'll be facing trial within the week. Trial. That word hit just as hard as the sentence itself. Jace opened his mouth, but no words came out. His thoughts spiraled. A trial meant this wasn't just going to disappear. His brand, his career, everything he had built was now dangling. Over a cliff, the officers stood up. You'll be transferred to a holding facility until then, the older one said. I suggest you start taking this seriously. Jace barely registered the handcuffs snapping back onto his wrists. The weight of reality hit him like a freight train. 10 years. His career was over. His life was over, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. The moment Jace stepped into the holding cell, the world he had built for himself shattered. The cold, damp walls, the stained concrete floor, the stench of sweat and something worse. It all crashed over him like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He wasn't in some VIP detention center where celebrities served their time in comfort. He was in a real prison, surrounded by a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, barely glanced up from his cot. Jace stood frozen by the metal bars, heart pounding. He had spent his life watching people react to him. Fans, haters, sponsors. But here, nobody. It cared who he was. Here, he was just another inmate. He sank onto the hard mattress, running his hands through his hair. 10 years. His mind refused to accept it. His phone was gone, his social media silent. What were people saying? Was #FreeJace trending? Were his fans outraged, demanding his release? His lawyer had visited him earlier, her expression tight, her words carefully measured. "The government is making an example of you," she had said. "They want to send a message." He had laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But now, sitting in this filthy, suffocating cell, the reality clawed at him. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. They wanted to ruin him. The next morning, the first headlines trickled in. He caught glimpses of a guard's newspaper through the bars, the bold letters jumping out at him. Influencer faces decade behind bars. Justice or overreaction? Royal Guard disrespect sparks global debate. Prank gone wrong. The rise and fall of Jace Carter. His stomach twisted. He knew the cycle. He had lived the cycle. The internet loved to build people up just to tear them down. And now, he was the story, the controversy, the headline people clicked on while sipping their morning coffee. His lawyer had been blunt. "Half the world thinks you deserve this. The other half thinks it's a human rights violation." Jace clenched his fists. His career had been founded on controversy, but this was different. This wasn't a Twitter war he could ignore until it blew over. This wasn't losing a sponsorship deal. This was his life. The guards pulled him from his cell that afternoon, leading him down a long corridor. Cameras flashed as soon as he stepped into the courtroom. His lawyer had warned him to keep his face neutral, to show remorse. But the moment he saw the judge's stern expression, his stomach dropped. The trial wasn't about what he had done anymore. It was about what he represented, a world of reckless influencers who thought they could do anything for clicks. And the system was about to make sure he paid the price for all of them. Jace sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The judge's expression was unreadable, but the weight in the air told him everything. This wasn't just a case, it was a message. He wasn't Jace Carter, influencer, social media star, prankster. He was an example, a warning to every content creator who thought they could get away with anything in the name of views. His lawyer stood, making a last, desperate argument. "Your Honor, my client is not a hardened criminal. He's a young man who made a foolish mistake. He has no prior record, no history of violence. This was a prank, misguided, yes, but hardly deserving of a 10-year sentence." The prosecutor scoffed. "A prank? That's what we're calling arson now?" He turned to the jury, voice dripping with contempt. This wasn't some harmless joke. This was an attack on national tradition, on the very identity of this country. Mr. Carter's actions show a blatant disregard for the law. And what's worse, he did it for attention. He risked the safety of an officer, one who was under strict orders not to react, for clicks. That's not just reckless, it's dangerous. If we do nothing, what stops the next fool from escalating? For views, the words hit harder than Jace wanted to admit. For clicks, that was the whole reason he'd done it, right? He'd chased the rush, the engagement, the viral moment. He had never stopped to think, really think, about what would happen next. The jury whispered among themselves. The judge exhaled, tapping a finger against his desk. The silence stretched until it felt suffocating. Then came the verdict. Jace Carter, for the crimes of criminal arson, destruction of state property, and endangerment of a national officer, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison." The room spun. Jace's breath caught in his throat. His lawyer stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We will be filing an appeal immediately." The judge barely looked at her. "You may do. So, the ruling stands." A buzz filled Jace's ears as the guards seized his arms. The courtroom blurred, faces twisting into expressions of shock, satisfaction, and in some cases, vindication. They wanted this. The internet was watching. The media was eating this up. A social media king brought to his knees. The cameras snapped as he was led away, flashing lights searing into his vision. His body moved on autopilot. The reality of 10 years hadn't fully settled in yet. Maybe. This was still a stunt. Maybe the judge would call him back and tell him the cameras could shut off now. Doors of the prison transport slammed shut. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a joke. Jace Carter was going to prison, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jace sat on the hard metal bench of the prison transport. His wrists still cuffed, his mind numb. The sentence echoed in his head over and over again. 10 years, not 10 days, not 10 months. A full decade behind bars. By the time he got out, the world would have moved on. His career over. His life unrecognizable. The van rumbled along the road, shaking with every bump. He barely noticed. The other inmates sat in silence, some staring at him, others lost in their own misery. Did they know who he was? Did they care? His entire existence had revolved around the internet. The constant buzz of notifications, the flood of comments that validated his every move. Now there was nothing, just the hum of the engine, the cold steel against his wrists, and the sinking realization that this wasn't temporary, this was real. The prison loomed in the distance, a massive grey fortress surrounded by razor wire. His stomach twisted as they pulled through the gates. A guard barked orders, and one by one, the inmates were hauled out. When it was his turn, rough hands gripped his arms, yanking him to his feet. "Welcome home, Carter," one of the guards sneered. The intake process was a blur, fingerprints, a mugshot, his clothes stripped away and replaced with a rough, faded jumpsuit. The number on his chest felt like a death sentence, a label that erased his identity. He wasn't Jace Carter, influencer. He was just another prisoner. The moment he stepped into general population, the noise hit him, yelling, laughing, metal doors slamming shut. A different kind of social hierarchy. He wasn't at the top anymore. Here, nobody cared about followers. Strength, reputation, and alliances ruled. Eyes followed him as he walked past rows of hardened criminals. Some whispered, some smirked, some sized him up. He kept his head down, his heart hammering. His cellmate was already inside when he arrived. A man in his 40s, thick arms covered in faded tattoos, sat on the lower bunk, flipping through a tattered book. He glanced up, unimpressed. "You're the YouTube kid, huh?" Jace hesitated. "Yeah," the man snorted. "That stunt of yours got people talking. Some think you're an idiot. Some think you got screwed." He closed the book. "Me? I don't care. Just don't get me in trouble." Jace nodded stiffly, sitting on the top bunk. He stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. This was his life now, no camera crew, no safety net. The days blurred. Prison was a different kind of isolation. No likes, no views, no constant validation, just time, endless time. Then, weeks later, in the dim light of the common area, Jace overheard a hushed conversation near the phones. "You see the leak?" "What leak?" "Footage from his trial. Turns out they set him up." Jace's blood ran cold. "What?" Jace froze. His fingers tightened around the tray of bland prison food, his appetite vanishing. "Set him up?" The words rang in his head, louder than the chaotic noise of the mess hall. He turned slightly, trying to get a better look at the two inmates whispering near the phones. "You serious?" one of them muttered. The other nodded, voice low. Someone leaked footage from his trial. The guards, the judge, the government, they wanted this to happen. They planned it before he even stepped into the courtroom. Jace's pulse pounded in his ears. He forced himself to stay calm, to not react. If he made it obvious that he was listening, that he was interested, people would notice. And in prison, standing out was a bad idea. He sat down at his usual table, barely aware of his surroundings. The words kept replaying. They wanted this to happen. He had known something felt off. The speed of the trial, the way the judge dismissed every argument his lawyer made, the way the sentence was handed down like it had been decided before he even walked in. A setup. But why? That night, after lockdown, Jace lay awake on the stiff mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. If this was true, he couldn't just sit here. He had to find out more. He had to find out who had leaked the footage and what was in it. The next day, he waited for an opening. The phone area was always monitored, but inmates still found ways to get around the rules. He had never used his phone privileges until now. When he finally got to the receiver, he dialed the only person he knew would answer, his lawyer. It rang, once, twice, then finally a voice on the other end. "Jace?" She sounded tense, her voice hushed. "You heard, didn't you?" His grip tightened on the phone. "Is it true?" A pause, then quietly, "Yes." His chest tightened. "Tell." Then exhaled. A hacker leaked private conversations between government officials, internal memos, emails. They wanted to make an example out of you. The government's been cracking down on social media stunts, and your case was the perfect opportunity. They needed a headline, someone big enough to scare others from doing the same thing. Jace's stomach churned. So I was never actually a threat. They just needed a scapegoat. Exactly. He felt sick. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about the prank. He had been used. "What happens now?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. "People are angry," she said. "The story's spreading fast. Protests are starting. We have a chance to fight this." Hope flickered in his chest. Then a sudden click. The line went dead. Jace turned his head slowly. A guard stood nearby, staring right at him. He wasn't supposed to know the truth, and now he was in danger. Jace lowered the phone slowly, his pulse thundering in his ears. The guard standing near the wall wasn't just watching him. He was waiting to see. If Jace would react, if he would panic, if he would make a move that confirmed he had heard something he wasn't supposed to. He forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let them see fear. Fear was weakness here. He nodded slightly, as if finishing a casual call, and placed the receiver back on the hook. Then, without hesitation, he turned and walked away. Every step felt like a test. Keep it cool. Don't look back. Don't run. He could feel the guard's eyes boring into him as he moved toward the common area, where the noise and chaos of other inmates provided some level of cover. He needed to think. If the guards knew he had found out about the leak, what would they do? Would they try to move him? Would they isolate him? Worse, would they silence him? His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them ended well. They didn't just want him in prison. They wanted him forgotten. By the time he reached his cell, his hands were shaking. His cellmate, the older man with the tattoos, glanced up from his book. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Jace hesitated. Could he trust him? Could he trust anyone in here? He sat on the edge of his bunk, rubbing his face. "I think they set me up." His cellmate let out a dry laugh. "No kidding. Welcome to the system." Jace looked up, frustrated. "No, I mean, they really set me up, like before the trial even started. The sentence was already decided." That got the man's attention. He closed his book, studying Jace for a long moment. Then, leaning in, slightly, he lowered his voice. "And now you know." Jace frowned. "What do you mean?" His cellmate's expression darkened. "You're not the first. You won't be the last." A chill ran through him. "What are you saying?" The man exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "This place, this system, it's built on keeping people inside. You think your case is special just because you're famous? No, you just got noticed. But the second you stop being useful, they'll bury you." Jace's stomach twisted. He had spent his life believing that if you were loud enough, famous enough, people had to listen to you. But what if that wasn't true? What if they had already decided his fate, and nothing he did mattered? A sudden commotion outside the cell made them both turn. The hallway buzzed with activity. Guards moved faster than usual. Then the PA system crackled to life. "All inmates, return to your cells immediately." A lockdown. Jace exchanged a look. With his cellmate, something was happening. Something big. The blaring announcement sent a ripple of tension through the prison. Inmates murmured, some moving toward their cells without question, others hesitating, trying to piece together what was happening. Lockdowns weren't random. Something had triggered it. Jace felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. Had it been the phone call? Had they shut everything down because of him? His cellmate stood, his usual calm demeanor shifting into something more alert. "Get in the cell," he muttered under his breath. "Now." Jace hesitated. The guards were moving, fast, eyes scanning the block, checking every face. He could see it in their expressions. They were looking for someone. Then it clicked. They were looking for him. His heart slammed against his ribs as he stepped back into the cell. The door clanked shut behind them, the automatic locks sealing them in. From the narrow window of the bars, he watched as a group of guards strode down the corridor, not the usual ones. These were higher-ups, men in suits, their movements precise and deliberate. His cellmate let out a low whistle. "Yeah, you pissed off the wrong people." Jace clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They knew he had spoken to his lawyer. They knew he had heard about the leaked footage, and now they were deciding what to do about it. The prison fell into eerie silence. The normal background noise, distant shouting, laughter, the occasional Then just outside his cell, the suits stopped. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and dead eyes, stepped forward. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like someone who made decisions. Jace Carter, his voice, was smooth, controlled. "You're coming with us." Jace's pulse spiked. His cellmate tensed beside him. "Don't go," he muttered under his breath. But what choice did he have? The cell door buzzed and slid open. The guards didn't grab him, didn't shove him. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Jace stepped out, forcing his legs to move, even though every instinct screamed at him to stop. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slid shut behind him. They led him through the facility, past silent inmates watching from behind their bars. They all knew something was happening. Finally, they reached a secluded hallway, a single door at the end. One of the suits swiped a keycard, and the lock clicked. Inside was a dimly lit room with a metal table and 2 chairs. No cameras, no windows. Jace sat. The man with slicked back hair took the seat across from him, lacing his fingers together. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Carter." Jace stared at him, pulse pounding. The man leaned in, his expression unreadable. "Now we have a problem." Jace sat stiffly in the chair, every muscle in his body locked in place. The room felt too small, the air too still. The man across from him, the one with the slicked back hair and the dead eyes, wasn't just a guard. He wasn't a warden. He was something else, something worse. "Do you understand the position you're in?" the man asked, voice smooth as glass. Jace swallowed hard, keeping his expression neutral. "I understand that you're trying really hard to intimidate me." A small, cold smile curled at the man's lips. "No, Carter, if we wanted to intimidate you, we'd be having a very different conversation." Jace's hands curled into fists. Under the table, his nails digging into his palms. He needed to keep his cool, but it was hard when everything inside him screamed that he was walking into a trap. The man leaned forward slightly. "You've become a problem. The world is watching. Your case. They're asking questions they shouldn't be asking. And now, thanks to that little leak, we're in a position we don't like." Jace forced himself to meet his gaze. "You mean a position where the truth is coming out?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Truth?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "The truth is whatever we decide it is." Jace's stomach twisted. He'd spent years thinking he was the one in control, controlling the narrative, the content, the clicks. But now he was just a pawn in someone else's game. The man folded his hands on the table. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to deny everything. You're going to say you were treated fairly, that there was no setup, no conspiracy. You'll tell your lawyer to drop the appeal, and in return we make this easy for you." Jace scoffed, shaking his head. "And if I don't," the man didn't blink, "then we make an example of you in a different way." Jace clenched his jaw. "You can't just—" The man held up a hand, cutting him off. "Carter, you don't matter. Not really. What matters is the message we send. He leaned in, voice dropping lower. And trust me, there are far worse ways for you to disappear than just rotting in here for 10 years. Jace's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew what this was. A final warning. A chance to fold before they crushed him completely. His mind raced. If they were this desperate, that meant the leak had shaken them. People were watching. People cared. If he backed down now, everything, every protest, every person fighting for his freedom would mean nothing. He exhaled slowly. Go to hell. For the first time, the man's smile disappeared. Jace knew in that moment he had just made the biggest gamble of his life. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Jace had expected the man to snap, to lash out, to show his true colors, but he didn't. Instead, he simply sat there, watching, as if considering his next move. That was somehow worse. Finally, the man sighed and pushed back his chair, standing, with an air of finality. You should have taken the deal, Carter. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it made Jace's stomach twist. Now, you'll find out what happens to people who don't cooperate. Jace refused to look away. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. The man motioned to the guards by the door. Take him back. Put him in solitary. No phone calls, no visitors. He glanced down at Jace. We'll see how long. Your little rebellion lasts when the world stops hearing from you. Jace gritted his teeth as the guards grabbed him by the arms and hauled him out of the room. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He couldn't afford different this time. The prison felt darker, the hallways longer, the air heavier. As they passed the main block, some inmates pressed against the bars, watching. Word had spread. They knew something was happening. His cellmate was gone. His bunk was empty. Before Jace could process that, the guards led him past his usual cell and down another corridor, one lined with heavy steel doors. Solitary confinement. A guard unlocked a door and shoved him inside. The metal door slammed shut behind him, sealing him into nothingness. The room was barely bigger than a closet. No window, no sound, just 4 grey walls and a metal cot. The air was thick and unmoving, pressing in on him from every direction. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. This was their next move. Cut him off, make him disappear, bury him in silence until the world moved on. Jace clenched his fists. He wasn't stupid. He knew how things worked. The media cycle was fast. If he disappeared for long enough, people would stop talking about him. The protests would die down. His fans would get distracted by something new. And just like that, he'd be forgotten. He sat on the cot, exhaling sharply. No, that wasn't happening. Not now. Not after everything. Jace wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This wasn't about a stupid prank. This was about power, about corruption, about a system that thought it could silence whoever it wanted. They wanted him quiet. They wanted him scared. Fine. Let's see how they handled it when he refused to be either. Jace lost track of time in the solitary cell. There was no clock, no window, no way to tell if it was morning or night. The silence stretched endlessly, pressing in on him, trying to break him down piece by piece. That was the goal. They wanted him to feel small, powerless, forgotten, but he refused to give in. He focused on the one thing that kept him going. The world outside these walls was still watching. His case wasn't fading away like they wanted. His name still burned across headlines, across protests, across every platform where people refused to let the government bury him. The guards brought him meals, but no one spoke to him. Days blurred together. His body ached from lying on the stiff cot, his mind restless with thoughts of what was happening beyond these walls. Had his lawyer filed the appeal? Had the protests grown? Or had they succeeded in making him disappear? Then, one day or night, he couldn't tell anymore, the heavy steel door groaned open. A guard stepped inside, eyes unreadable. Get up, Jace's heart pounded as he was led out of the solitary wing. His body felt weak, stiff, but adrenaline pushed him forward. They took him down the long grey hallways, past rows of cells where inmates paused to watch. Some nodded at him, others whispered. They knew something was happening. When they reached the warden's office, his lawyer was waiting, and she wasn't alone. Two government officials stood stiffly beside her, their expressions tight, their jaws clenched. They weren't happy. His lawyer turned to him, and for the first time in a long time, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen since this nightmare started. "Hope, Jace," she said, clearing her throat. "Your appeal has been reviewed." The taller official adjusted his tie, his lips pressing into a thin line. "The court has ruled that due to improper legal procedures, your original trial is now void. Effective immediately, your sentence is overturned." Jace's breath caught. No, that couldn't be real. He stared at them, waiting for the catch, the trick. But there wasn't one. "You're free to go," his lawyer added, her voice shaking slightly, the words barely registered. Free. The walk out of the prison felt surreal. The sky was blinding after so long in a dim cell. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters cheered. Jace Carter was a free man. But as he stood there, breathing in fresh air for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew he wasn't the same person who had walked in. The old Jace, the influencer. Chasing clout was gone. They had tried to silence him. Now he was going to make sure they never did this to anyone else again.